Emily Donovan was supposed to walk down the aisle in a white dress, her hand in Daniel Reed's, surrounded by family, flowers, and forever promises. But instead, she vanished without a trace, leaving behind a shattered bouquet, a frantic groom, and a mystery that would haunt a town for 20 years. What began as a fairy tale wedding unraveled into a chilling story of lies, buried secrets, and a truth darker than anyone could imagine. On June 17, 2005, the town of Fairpine, Vermont, awoke with excitement in the air. The weather was warm and bright, a perfect summer day. The small community buzzed with talk of one event, Emily Donovan's wedding. It wasn't just any wedding. Emily, a 26-year-old elementary school teacher, was one of the town's most beloved residents. She had taught second grade at Fairpine Elementary for 4 years and was known for her kindness, her patience with children, and the way she volunteered at every local event. Her fiancé, Daniel Reed, was equally admired, a successful architect who had moved back to Fairpine to be closer to family. Daniel had recently opened a design firm in town. Together, they were the picture-perfect couple, the kind people rooted for. They had dated in high school briefly, then gone their separate ways for college. Fate brought them back together years later at a mutual friend's barbecue. The romance rekindled almost instantly. Within a year, Daniel had proposed during a trip to Paris. The story was told often, how he got down on one knee in front of the Eiffel Tower, how she cried and said yes before he even finished the question. The ring, a family heirloom, sparkled on her hand. Their engagement was the stuff of dreams. The wedding was to take place at St. Mark's Church, a white steepled building that stood proudly on the edge of town. Every pew had been decorated with white ribbons and lilies, and over 200 guests were invited. Emily's bridesmaids, all wearing pale blue dresses, arrived early to help her get ready. The makeup artist came at 9 a.m. The hairdresser followed soon after. Emily had been smiling all morning, they said. Calm, excited, happy. She posed for photos in her robe, holding a champagne glass and laughing with her friends. Everything appeared normal. By 1 p.m., Emily was in her dress, a lace and satin gown with delicate beading. The photographer snapped pictures of her by the window of the bridal suite, the light falling gently across her veil. She held her bouquet, a mix of white roses and baby's breath, and said she couldn't wait to see Daniel. There were no signs of nerves, no hesitation, no tears. But at 2:30 p.m., just 30 minutes before the ceremony, one of the bridesmaids knocked on the suite door. There was no answer. Thinking Emily might be adjusting her dress, she knocked again. Still nothing. When they opened the door, the room was empty. At first, no one panicked. The bridesmaids assumed she had stepped out to use the restroom or speak with the wedding planner. But 10 minutes passed, then 20. The makeup artist said she hadn't seen Emily leave. Neither had the photographer, who had gone downstairs to prepare for the ceremony. Her phone was still sitting on the vanity table. Her purse was untouched in the corner. Her shoes, ivory heels with tiny pearls, were still beside the chair. There was no note, no message. By 3 p.m., guests were seated, murmuring quietly, as the organist played softly. Daniel stood at the altar, looking down the aisle, waiting. The wedding planner whispered nervously to the priest. The bridesmaids huddled together, their faces pale. Someone called Emily's parents, who were sitting in the front pew, and took them aside. Then came the moment no one wanted to admit. Emily Donovan was missing. Daniel was pulled into a side room, confused and shaken. He thought it was some sort of joke or a delay. But when he saw her things still in the dressing room and no one could reach her, the panic set in. Her father called the police just before 4 p.m. By 6 p.m., a full-scale search was underway. Officers canvassed the church and surrounding streets. They checked the parking lot, the restrooms, the basement. Helicopters were called in to fly over the nearby woods. Volunteers lined up to help comb through fields and riverbanks. The media caught wind quickly. A missing bride on her wedding day made for gripping headlines. The last confirmed sighting of Emily was at 1:45 p.m., when the photographer took the final portrait. No one reported seeing her after that. There were no surveillance cameras in the church, and the parking lot cameras showed no clear footage of her leaving. The church's side doors remained locked. No car was missing. Her vehicle was still, parked exactly where she had left it that morning. Rumors began to swirl almost instantly. Some speculated she had cold feet and ran away. Others believed she had been kidnapped. A few wondered if she had uncovered a secret about Daniel and fled. Her friends insisted she was happy, that she had looked forward to this day more than anything. Her parents, in disbelief, held press conferences pleading for answers. Daniel, pale and hollow-eyed, told reporters he just wanted her home safe. As night fell on June 17th, Emily's wedding dress still hung on the back of a chair in the bridal suite. Her bouquet had begun to wilt. Her phone buzzed with dozens of missed calls and texts from concerned friends. The reception hall, set for a grand celebration, stood in silence. Tables were filled with untouched plates and half-melted ice sculptures. The DJ had packed up quietly and left. Guests lingered, hugging each other, whispering fears they dared not say aloud. The town of Fairpine, which had expected a joyful celebration, was plunged into confusion and sorrow. No clues, no witnesses, no evidence. Just a young woman, full of life and promise, who had stepped out of a room and vanished. The case would soon become one of the most baffling disappearances in Vermont's history. For the first time in over 100 years, St. Mark's Church canceled a wedding mid-ceremony. But what no one knew that day, what would only be uncovered 2 decades later, was that Emily Donovan's disappearance wasn't a moment of panic or a random act of violence. It was the beginning of something far more sinister, a carefully hidden truth. A dark secret buried so deep it would take 20 years and a new generation to finally unearth it. The days following Emily Donovan's disappearance passed in a blur of confusion, disbelief, and fear. Fairpine, a town that had always felt safe and familiar, suddenly seemed unfamiliar and shadowed. Streets that once held warmth and cheer were now quiet, lined with missing person flyers bearing Emily's smiling face. Her name echoed through the town, spoken in hushed voices in coffee shops, printed in bold headlines across local newspapers, and repeated over and over in nightly news reports. The investigation launched quickly. Local police brought in state authorities and search and rescue teams. Bloodhounds were called in to trace any scent trail from the church grounds, but none were found. Divers were sent into nearby rivers. Drones flew over wooded areas. Volunteers spent their days combing through the surrounding countryside. Emily's face was broadcast on regional television and her parents pleaded publicly for any information. Still, nothing surfaced. No witnesses, no suspicious vehicles, no strange sightings. It was as though Emily had simply disappeared into thin air. The entire town rallied behind the family. Candlelight vigils were held in the town square. Ribbons were tied to trees and lampposts in Emily's favorite color, lavender. Her second-grade classroom was left untouched, a vase of fresh flowers placed weekly on her desk by colleagues. Former students left drawings and notes taped to the school gate, messages written in crayon and marker, some spelling out the same question everyone was asking: where did Miss Donovan go? Detectives turned their focus to Emily's personal life, looking for anything that might offer a clue. They questioned family members, friends, colleagues, and former students' parents. No one reported any tension or concerns. Her relationships appeared stable and supportive. Her finances were in order. She had no history of mental illness or erratic behavior. No indication of a desire to leave behind her life. Daniel Reed, the groom left waiting at the altar, was questioned extensively. His grief seemed raw. Friends told investigators that Daniel had been excited about the wedding, deeply in love with Emily, and committed to starting a future with her. He cooperated fully, turned over his phone, consented to searches of his car and home, and answered every question. He passed a polygraph test. Police found nothing suspicious in his background. In the eyes of many, he was just another victim of an unimaginable tragedy. Still, rumors lingered. Some wondered if Daniel had something to hide. Others whispered about the pressure of small-town expectations, of two people being forced into marriage too quickly. A few speculated that Emily might have discovered something dark, about her fiancé and tried to escape. But without evidence, these were only theories, baseless whispers in a grieving town. The case made national headlines for a brief period. True crime programs picked up the story. Pundits debated the possibilities on talk shows. The mystery of the missing bride captivated the public imagination, even as interest eventually faded with time. Other tragedies took the spotlight. Other names replaced Emily's in the news cycle. But in Fairpine, she was never forgotten. A year passed, then 2. Her room at her parents' house remained untouched. The closet still held the clothes she had packed for the honeymoon she never took. The bookshelf still held childhood photos and worn paperbacks. Her mother left a light on in the window every night, just in case Emily came home. Despite countless interviews, searches, and tips, the investigation turned up nothing. Leads that once held promise dissolved into dead ends. Suspects that once seemed likely were ruled out. Theories came and went, but no answers followed. Slowly, the active search turned into a cold case. In 2012, 7 years after she disappeared, Emily was declared legally dead. The court ruling came with mixed emotions. It offered some measure of closure for official records, but for those who loved her, it only deepened the pain. There was no body, no crime scene, no confession. Just paperwork. Daniel moved away shortly. Afterward, he sold his house in Fairpine and relocated to Florida, taking a job with a growing real estate firm. His departure caused another stir in the community, with some seeing it as an attempt to move forward, and others questioning why he would leave so soon after the declaration. Despite the gossip, no formal charges were ever brought against him. To the law, he was not a suspect, just a grieving fiancé with no answers. Emily's parents remained in Fairpine. They refused to move, afraid Emily might return and not know where to go. Every year on the anniversary of her disappearance, they organized a memorial walk through the town. Supporters carried candles, wore lavender ribbons, and held signs that read, "Still searching." As the years passed, the crowd grew smaller, but the dedication remained. For them, time didn't bring healing. It only brought distance from the last time they had seen their daughter. Occasionally, tips would trickle in. A woman matching Emily's description was seen in another town, another state. A mysterious phone call was made to a hotline and abruptly ended. A psychic claimed to see her spirit in a field outside of town. Each lead was investigated, but none led to Emily. The case file grew thicker with time, filled with notes, photographs, maps, interviews, and unanswered questions. Detectives came and went. Some retired. Others inherited the case, but found themselves staring at the same wall of information with no path forward. It became a story told to new recruits, a mystery that haunted the department, but one they no longer believed would ever be solved. The church where the wedding was meant to take place still stood quiet. St. Mark's stopped hosting weddings for a few years out of respect, but eventually resumed. Yet for those who remembered that day in 2005, the building always carried a sense of sadness. Some avoided it entirely. Others spoke of feeling something different in the air when they walked through the doors. A silence too deep. A chill, too sudden. Life in Fairpine moved on. Children grew up. New families moved in. Businesses opened and closed. But Emily's story remained a thread woven into the town's identity. Her photo stayed on the bulletin board at the post office. Her name was still spoken by those who had known her, those who had loved her, and those who could never forget the day joy turned to grief in the blink of an eye. For almost 20 years the case remained cold, and as time marched forward, most assumed the truth would never be known. But secrets have a strange way of surfacing, and in the most unlikely place, a long-sealed box was about to open, and with it, a truth no one in Fairpine could have ever imagined. In early 2025, Fairpine was no longer the sleepy little town it had once been. A new housing development was underway on the edge of the woods near Old Quarry Road, a stretch of land that had remained untouched for decades. The area was overgrown with trees and brush, largely avoided by locals, except for the occasional hiker or hunter. The property had recently been purchased by a development company planning to build luxury townhomes, and crews had moved in to begin clearing the land. On a chilly morning in March, a team of workers began digging for a utility trench behind a ridge of pine trees. They expected nothing more than a layer of rock and clay, but within a few feet, their shovels struck something harder than stone, metal. As they cleared the dirt away, they uncovered an old, rusted storage trunk. It was heavy, sealed shut with 2 corroded latches and covered in layers of soil and moss. At first, they thought it might be an abandoned piece of junk. Still, they reported it to the site manager, who decided to call the police just to be safe. When officers arrived, they cordoned off the area and carefully opened the trunk. Inside was a tarp, tightly wrapped and tied with rope. The moment they pulled it open, the smell confirmed what many feared. It was a body. Decades of decay had left it skeletal, but remnants of clothing and a delicate gold necklace clung to the remains. The necklace held a tiny charm in the shape of a book, one that Emily Donovan had worn every day. The discovery spread through Fairpine like wildfire. News vans returned to the town, Cameras pointed at the scene, and once again, Emily's name filled the headlines. After nearly 20 years, her body had been found. For the first time since her disappearance, there was something tangible, something real. DNA testing confirmed what many already believed. The remains belonged to Emily Donovan. The site was treated as a crime scene. Forensic teams combed through the surrounding area, collecting evidence from the shallow grave. The condition of the trunk suggested it had been buried intentionally and with care. Whoever had done it had wanted her to stay hidden. No immediate clues were found, but the discovery reignited an investigation long thought dead. Detectives revisited the original case file, poring over every page, every interview, every overlooked detail. Emily's final hours were scrutinized. Again. The guest list was reviewed. The church staff were re-questioned. Daniel Reed's name returned to the top of the list, not because of new evidence, but because he had always been at the center of the mystery. They tracked Daniel down in Florida. He had since remarried and had 2 children. When told of the discovery, he expressed shock and sorrow. He claimed to have no knowledge of how Emily ended up buried in a trunk near Old Quarry Road. He denied any involvement and offered to cooperate fully. Detectives took a fresh look at his timeline on the day of the wedding, trying to determine if he could have transported the body and buried it in the hours before or after the ceremony. But his movements had been well documented. Dozens of witnesses had seen him at the church, then at the police station, then at home with his parents. There was no obvious gap of time when he could have carried out the crime unnoticed. Still, suspicion lingered. It always had. Then came a break. While reviewing background records, an officer noticed something odd in the real estate paperwork from 2003. The land where Emily had been found had once belonged to Daniel's uncle, a reclusive man named Thomas Reed. He had died in 2011, and the property had sat unused ever since. At the time of Emily's disappearance, it had been private land, quiet, unmonitored, and just outside town limits. Investigators began looking into Thomas Reed's history. A quiet bachelor in his 60s, he had lived alone in a small cabin, not far from the burial site. He had no criminal record, no known history of violence, and had never been questioned during the original investigation. But something about the proximity of his land to the burial site was too coincidental to ignore. Detectives obtained a warrant to search the old cabin, now abandoned and falling apart. Inside, they found stacks of old newspapers, tools, and personal items, mostly unremarkable. But in the back room, hidden under loose floorboards, they found a sealed envelope. Inside was a letter written in shaky handwriting. It was dated July 2005, just weeks after Emily's disappearance. The letter changed everything. In it, Thomas confessed to an act he claimed was done to protect the family. He wrote that Emily had come to him in distress on the morning of her wedding. According to the letter, she had learned something about Daniel, a secret he did not specify but described as dangerous and dark. She had planned to cancel the wedding and leave town that same day. Thomas claimed he tried to calm her down, but when she insisted on going to the police, he panicked. He wrote that he couldn't let her destroy everything, and in a moment of fear, he did what had to be done. He described luring her to the cabin under the pretense of offering help, then killing her and hiding the body in a trunk. He buried it deep on the property and told no one. The letter ended with a cryptic line. Some truths should stay buried. The discovery stunned investigators. Thomas Reed had died of natural causes years earlier, and the letter, while not entirely clear, offered a direct connection to Emily's death. It also raised new questions. What had Emily discovered? What secret had she planned to reveal that caused such fear in Thomas? And was Daniel truly innocent, or had his uncle taken the fall for something more complicated? Despite the letter, Daniel was not cleared. Authorities believed it was possible he had confided in his uncle, or that Thomas had acted on his behalf. But with no concrete evidence tying Daniel to the crime and the sole confession written by a now dead man, the case hit another wall. The district attorney declined to pursue charges against Daniel due to lack of prosecutable proof. Emily's body was finally laid to rest in a cemetery near her childhood home. Hundreds attended her memorial, a mix of sorrow and relief in the air. Fairpine mourned her once again, this time with answers, but not all of them. The truth had come closer, but shadows still lingered. There was more to the story. The final chapter had not yet been written. Months passed after the discovery of Emily Donovan's body, and Fairpine tried once again to settle into a sense of normalcy. But the town, still haunted by her story, remained restless. Whispers of unfinished business spread quietly, like wind through trees. The letter from Thomas Reed had solved the mystery of where Emily had gone, but not why. And for those who knew Emily best, especially her parents, that distinction mattered. Detectives continued to probe the old cabin, sifting through every drawer, every scrap of paper, looking for anything that might clarify Thomas's motivations. Among the clutter, they uncovered a collection of VHS tapes stored in a rotting box beneath the kitchen sink. Most appeared to be home recordings of local television programs, nothing out of the ordinary. But one tape stood out. It was unmarked, with no label or date. The footage on the tape was grainy, distorted by time, but its contents were unmistakable. It showed Emily Donovan sitting in what appeared to be the interior of Thomas Reed's cabin. She looked distressed but composed, as though she had willingly gone there. The camera angle was fixed, likely placed on a table. Emily spoke quietly, her voice muffled by the poor recording quality, but fragments were audible. She spoke of fear, of discovering something that changed how she saw Daniel forever. Though the specifics were lost in static, she mentioned papers she had found in his desk drawer weeks before the wedding. Something about a previous relationship, a woman who had vanished under unusual circumstances. Emily said she had tried to push the doubts away, telling herself it couldn't be true. But the more she looked, the more convinced she became that Daniel had lied to her about his past. She ended by saying, "If something happens to me, someone needs to ask Daniel about New Hope." New Hope was a small town 2 hours away. Detectives immediately redirected their investigation there. A search through missing persons records revealed a case from 2001, 4 years before Emily's disappearance. A 24-year-old woman named Stephanie Lane had vanished without a trace. Her case, much like Emily's, had gone cold. At the time, police had few leads, but a connection began to take shape. Stephanie had worked briefly at a hardware store in New Hope. Witnesses from the time recalled she had been dating a man named Danny. No one could remember his last name, and the man had never been identified. The relationship had ended abruptly just before Stephanie vanished. No one had connected it to Daniel Reed, who had gone by Danny during his college years. He had lived in a nearby town at the time and had no criminal record. Investigators dug into Daniel's history, They confirmed that he had indeed lived 30 minutes from New Hope in 2001 and had worked a summer job in the area. Travel records, work logs, and phone data from that year placed him in proximity to Stephanie Lane. But the evidence was still circumstantial. Nothing directly linked him to her disappearance. Still, the parallels were unsettling. Stephanie Lane had disappeared in early May 2001. She was last seen walking home from work. Her apartment showed no signs of struggle. Her purse and personal items were left behind. The case had baffled local law enforcement at the time. Now, with Emily's tape suggesting a hidden connection, authorities revisited the Lane file with renewed urgency. They reached out to Stephanie's family, who still lived in New Hope. Her younger sister, Rachel, had never stopped believing Stephanie's boyfriend had something to do with her disappearance. She provided old photographs and journals, including a page where Stephanie had written the name Daniel R., followed by a phone number. It was an old landline, long since disconnected, but it had once belonged to Daniel Reed's family home. This was the first verifiable link between Daniel and Stephanie. Investigators approached the district attorney with this new information. While not enough to press charges, it justified a deeper search. A warrant was issued to examine Daniel's digital history, including old email accounts and computer drives. They uncovered deleted messages between Daniel and an anonymous account, registered to a burner email service. The tone was informal, even affectionate, and spanned months in 2001. One message stood out. Dated just days before Stephanie Lane's disappearance, Daniel had written, "We can't keep doing this. If anyone finds out about New Hope, it's over. You need to stop asking questions." Another message followed shortly after. "Don't come to my house again. It's not safe for either of us." Detectives believed Emily had stumbled upon this digital correspondence while Daniel was in the shower or asleep, maybe during one of the weekends they spent together before the wedding. It explained the reference to papers and her growing fear. Her instincts had told her something was very wrong. She had planned to confront Daniel. She may have even threatened to report what she found. Instead, she had vanished. The theory that Thomas Reed acted alone began to crack. Investigators now believed that Daniel had turned to his uncle when Emily discovered his secrets. The letter from Thomas may have been a carefully constructed deflection, a way to absolve Daniel by taking full responsibility. Whether Thomas acted out of loyalty, guilt, or something darker remained unclear. But the evidence now pointed to a deeper conspiracy. As the investigation intensified, Daniel's life in Florida unraveled. His employer placed him on leave. Neighbors once friendly grew distant. His wife filed for divorce, taking their children and moving back to her family's home in Georgia. Daniel hired a defense attorney and refused further interviews. He maintained his innocence, stating that Thomas had manipulated everything and that he had no knowledge of Emily's murder or Stephanie's disappearance. Despite public pressure, prosecutors held off on charging Daniel. Without direct evidence, placing him at either crime scene, a conviction would be difficult. But they weren't finished. A task force was formed to cross-reference Daniel's past with other unsolved missing person cases between 1998 and 2005. Meanwhile, the tape of Emily's confession was released to her parents. They watched it in silence, tears falling as they listened to their daughter speak from beyond the grave. It didn't give them everything, but it gave them enough. Enough to know she had been brave, that she had tried to protect herself, that she had fought back, even if the world hadn't listened in time. the people of Fairpine held another vigil that spring. This time, it was not just in memory of Emily Donovan, but for Stephanie Lane, and perhaps for others yet unknown. The wind carried the sound of whispered prayers, and candle flames flickered in the dusk. The truth, long buried, was rising, piece by piece. But the final revelation still waited in the shadows. And the past wasn't finished with Daniel Reed. In the months following the re-examination of Emily Donovan's murder and the sudden reappearance of Stephanie Lane's cold case, the story spread beyond Fairpine and New Hope. National news outlets picked up the thread, labeling Daniel Reed a man of shadows, a clean-cut face hiding decades of secrets. While legal authorities still lacked enough evidence to formally charge him, public opinion was swift and unforgiving. Daniel's life, once rebuilt after Emily's disappearance, began to crumble under the weight of suspicion. Pressure mounted on the task force. Each new lead was chased relentlessly. Daniel's college years, old jobs, short-term rentals, and even camping trips were examined for patterns or unexplained gaps. Through painstaking data recovery and witness outreach, investigators stumbled upon a promising new angle. In 2000, during Daniel's junior year at university, he had volunteered briefly at a summer youth camp in rural Tennessee. A quick scan of police records in that region revealed another missing persons case. A camp counselor named Amy Weller, age 22, who vanished during the final weekend of that same summer. Her disappearance had been considered a tragic accident, possibly lost during a solo hike through the woods, but her body had never been found. Detectives compared Daniel's documented whereabouts during that week. He had officially signed out of the camp the day before Amy was reported missing. When they questioned camp staff, one former counselor recalled a late-night argument between Daniel and Amy on the last night he was there. At the time, no one had thought much of it. They had assumed it was a simple disagreement between co-workers. But now, with context, it took on a more sinister tone. A familiar pattern emerged. Daniel forming relationships with women who later disappeared, each tied to moments in his life when stress, fear of exposure, or emotional escalation could have tipped him toward violence. The circumstantial net around him tightened, even as he stayed silent under legal protection. His attorney argued that none of these cases individually implicated him, and that the media was stitching together a narrative without proof. But then, in a development no one expected, another letter surfaced. It arrived anonymously at the Fairpine Police Department in a yellowed envelope with no return address. Inside was a single page, typewritten and unsigned. It claimed to be written by Thomas Reed, postmarked from 2008, 3 years after his initial confession letter. The writing style matched the first letter, and forensic analysts later confirmed the typewriter used was the same as one found in Thomas's cabin. The second letter painted a darker picture. In it, Thomas wrote about regret and being lied to. He spoke of covering up a crime he didn't fully understand at the time. He referred to a night when Daniel came to him, panicked and shaking, carrying something heavy in his car trunk. Thomas claimed Daniel begged him to make the problem disappear. He never asked what happened, and Daniel never told him. But Thomas helped bury the trunk anyway, convincing himself that protecting his nephew was the right thing to do. He ended the letter with chilling clarity. She was already gone when I opened the trunk. I didn't want to know how. But now, I do. With this new letter, the story changed once again. Thomas's previous confession, seemingly noble, was now recast as an act of loyalty, built on partial truths and self-deception. He hadn't killed Emily. He had simply hidden her body. Armed with the letter and other circumstantial evidence, investigators finally had enough to bring the case to a grand jury. In late August 2025, nearly 20 years after Emily Donovan vanished on her wedding day, Daniel Reed was formally indicted for her murder. He was arrested at his home in Florida without incident. His mugshot, blank and composed, was broadcast nationwide. For many, it was the face of evil. For others, it was a grim reminder of how long someone can live free while hiding the darkest parts of themselves. The trial began the following spring. It drew crowds from Fairpine and beyond, with every seat in the courtroom filled. The prosecution laid out the timeline in detail. How Emily had uncovered Daniel's secret past, how she had planned to leave him on their wedding day, and how he had panicked and turned to the one person he trusted to clean up the mess. They showed the video of Emily in Thomas's cabin, played the audio clips where she spoke of fear and betrayal, and presented the letters as evidence of a cover-up. The defense argued that Daniel was being tried on feelings, not facts. They claimed Thomas Reed had acted alone, and that Daniel had no knowledge of the burial or the murder. They dismissed the tape as vague and speculative. The jury listened, day after day, as the story unfolded like a puzzle with jagged edges. But the most damning moment came when forensic experts testified that DNA found under Emily's fingernails, preserved through careful analysis, contained partial matches to Daniel Reed. Combined with the timeline, the letters, and the mounting circumstantial evidence from other disappearances, the picture became clear. After 2 weeks of deliberation, the jury returned with a unanimous verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. Daniel Reed was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of tears, quiet applause, and exhausted silence. Emily's parents embraced one another. They had waited 2 decades to hear someone say, unequivocally, what had happened to their daughter. The questions had finally been answered, though at a heavy cost. But even with the verdict, the ripple effects continued. Investigators reclassified the Stephanie Lane and Amy Weller cases as open homicide investigations, now with a primary suspect. Though Daniel refused to speak, declining every interview, detectives began building new cases against him, hoping to deliver justice to other families still living in the dark. Fairpine slowly returned to stillness, though it was forever changed. Emily's name was etched into a memorial at the town square, alongside a plaque that read, "In memory of those whose truths were hidden, but never forgotten." In the end, the mystery that began on a sunny wedding day became something more than just a local tragedy. It revealed the uncomfortable truth that evil often wears a familiar face, and that silence can bury secrets deeper than the earth ever could. But secrets have a way of rising, and when they do, even time cannot protect the guilty.